The Synchromystic presents Synchromystique. In my wide-ranging survey of Neoplatonism, I included a section on the 4th to 5th century church father, Saint Augustine of Hippo. Augustine's influence, both in the Catholic Church and across Protestant Christianity, when it arose in the 16th century, is difficult to overstate. In fact, Augustine was only one of 4 early church personalities to receive the high approbation of being named a Doctor of the Church. This was in recognition of the great advantage the whole Church has derived from his doctrines. It's safe to say, then, that Augustine, who, according to Google, was canonized by Pope Boniface VIII in 1303, was a pillar of Christian orthodoxy. Due to this, it has struck some readers, or viewers, as somewhere between odd, mistaken, and scandalous for me to have seemingly enrolled Augustine among the ranks of the Neoplatonists. For example, one commenter stated in part, "I am not certain that as many church fathers as you have listed were of Neoplatonic orientation. The occult may claim them as their own, but many times that is an advertising gimmick. In the case of Augustine, I dispute the notion that he was a Neoplatonist. He was an implacable foe of Hermes and Hermeticism, which are inseparable from Platonism. The occultists deceitfully claim him for their own, predicated on trifles, because he did not deny the intellectual capacity of Plato, for example, which is a tribute to Augustine's prudence and probity. In his masterwork, City of God Against the Pagans, the last 3 words of the title are often omitted in the modern era. For example, in Book 9, Chapter 16, he clearly distinguishes between Christianity and Plato. Furthermore, Augustine rejected the Renaissance Neoplatonic appeal to the pagan philosophers as forerunners who bore witness to the validity of Christianity." End quote. First of all, thank you so much for reading and for commenting. Admittedly, in the original article and in its companion video, I may not have adequately distinguished Augustinianism from Plotinian Neoplatonism. Once properly distinguished, however, I would still argue that what we have with St. Augustine is a species of Christian Platonism. So let's dive in, and I'll try harder to make that case. Recall that I started off the original video with a summary of some major tenets of Neoplatonism, especially as it was formulated by its ancient framers. Please see, or see again, that presentation for the full story. But to aid comprehension here, and as a refresher, here are the 5 that I listed. Number 1. Neoplatonism's view that the world is a hierarchy of entities with something called the One at the top. Number 2. Neoplatonism's doctrine of emanation, according to which all other realities emerge from the One. Number 3, Neoplatonism's pantheism, its near identification of the divine with the entire universe. Number 4, Neoplatonism's related mysticism, or its preoccupation with the idea that human souls ought to strive to ascend to and reunite with the One. And 5, Neoplatonism's tendency towards syncretism. This has to do with the idea of harmonizing or combining notions from competing religious and philosophical systems into a single system. Let me say right off the bat, and for the record, that I never meant to imply that St. Augustine was a Neoplatonist in the sense of advocating or subscribing to any of these 5 doctrines. I tried to caveat the material in the original presentation, or at least I thought I did. I guess I never gave a direct disclaimer, as I just have. Of the Neoplatonic varieties that do accept the 5 basic beliefs sketched above, I think a case can be made that many, or even most, are heavily, and even possibly inextricably, wedded to Hermeticism. Although the occult-leaning journalist Jason Louv described Hermeticism, Neoplatonism, and operative magic as 3 distinct yet intertwining schools of thought, and I basically agree with that. Regardless, I don't think, and I have absolutely no interest in arguing, that Augustine was a Hermeticist in any meaningful sense. Now, I'm going to kick a discussion of the topic of Hermeticism into an afterword. Here, I'll note the remarks of Egyptologist Ronaldo Pereira, who listed Augustine among those other writers, also including Arnobius, Cyril of Alexandria, Lactantius, and Tertullian, who discussed Hermetic literature and thereby helped to shape its reception. Of course, it's one thing to read and discuss Hermetic texts and help to shape their reception, and it's quite another thing to endorse the text's world worldview. The Church Fathers, including Augustine, rejected the Hermetic as paganism, but they noted that similarities could be found within their Christian theology and Hermeticism. Some of them did. Many early Christian fathers went as far as to quote the Hermetic texts in their campaigns against heresies. Now, before I use the occasion of the comment to unpack further details about Plato and the Platonic Neoplatonic legacy, as well as to clarify the way I see Augustinianism, I'll try to answer the most pressing question. If Augustine did not hold any of the distinctive Neoplatonic beliefs, the ones that I started off listing, belief in the one, emanation, pantheism, mysticism, and syncretism, then why would I feature Augustine in a video on Neoplatonism? There are several reasons. Firstly, Augustine was, in my estimation, some kind of a Platonist, and Platonism and Neoplatonism are often treated together. Indeed, as I believe I mentioned in my opening remarks in the deep dive into Neoplatonism video, there's arguably an inconsistency in the literature about how to refer to Plato's multifaceted intellectual heirs. Sometimes Platonism and Neoplatonism are distinguished, while other times they're used synonymously. This does give rise to confusion, and I hope I haven't contributed to that. I suggest that there are actually two operative senses of Neoplatonism. One is the technical sense. On this narrow use, a thinker counts as Neoplatonic if and only if that thinker was a disciple of Plotinus, practices mysticism, and upholds the 5 tenets that I started off with. So, in this case, not Augustine. Then again, note well that Plato himself was not a Neoplatonist in the technical sense, either historically or ideologically. Now, this may seem too obvious to mention, but we should carefully distinguish Plato from Plato's Neoplatonic descendants. Subsequent thinkers, Plotinus, Porphyry, Iamblichus, Proclus, and so on, embellished and even mystified Plato's thought and took it in new directions. For example, toward metaphysical monism and toward religious pantheism, directions that Plato did not overtly endorse. Secondly, a distinction between Plato and the Neoplatonists is important because it's doubtful that Augustine read Plato's Greek dialogues directly. Rather, Augustine encountered Plato via various Neoplatonists, chiefly Plotinus and Porphyry. By the way, the basis for this video is a longer presentation with copious footnotes that is available on Substack, and I'll put a link in the description, and I may display it at the end of the video, if I remember. Going back to the question of terms, if we insist on what I earlier called a strict use of Neoplatonism, that is, if we're going to say that Neoplatonists are all and only those who are pantheists, syncretists, and so on, then we should equally recognize that the word Platonism marks off the pre-Plotinian, non-mystical philosophy of Plato himself. But a second use of Neoplatonism is broader. So if the first use just referred to people who believed in the one, emanation, pantheism, syncretism, and mysticism, a thinker in a broader sense is Neoplatonic if they're indebted to Plato no matter how. So most of the major Neoplatonists in this loose sense have put some novel spin on the doctrines they inherited from Plato. In fact, one of the main points that I was trying to suggest in my original presentation was that, in my opinion, Neoplatonism, in this looser sense, can be thought of as coming in sub-varieties, Neoplatonisms, plural, if you like. Sticking to ancient Neoplatonism, the subcategories that I enumerated were the following: pagan, anti-Christian Neoplatonism, especially of a type modeled on the work of Iamblichus; Christian Neoplatonism, modeled on the thought of Augustine; Neoplatonic Christianity, that comes along especially as the result of the work of Pseudo-Dionysius, or Dionysius the Pseudo-Areopagite, and which becomes dominant in the Renaissance; and non-Christian Neoplatonisms of other sorts. This would be Islamic, Judaic, etc. Now, in the broad sense, Neoplatonism then is not always Hermetic. We've got to take systems and thinkers on a case-by-case basis. Plotinus would still be a Neoplatonist in the second sense, as would Iamblichus, but Iamblichus would also count as a Hermeticist. Augustine would be a non-Hermetic Neoplatonist of a Christian variety. In other words, he would not be a Hermeticist. Pseudo-Dionysius was a very different sort of Christian Neoplatonist, and in his case, he was much more Hermetic, and so on. And that's the kind of thing I had in mind. So we do need to make an initial terminological decision about the way we want to talk. If we allow for a loose way of speaking, and I'm willing to allow it, then broad Neoplatonism can refer to the entire spectrum of thought that is in some sense Platonic. And I'll get into much more of this in a minute. However, we certainly can reserve the term Neoplatonism for the Hermetic line, the one that started with Ammonius Saccas and Plotinus, proceeded through Iamblichus, Proclus, Dionysius, and so on, and ultimately gained traction in supposedly Christian circles during the Renaissance. I don't prefer this way of speaking because I think it blurs the lines among the subtypes that I'd rather distinguish, such as pagan Neoplatonism and Neoplatonic Christianity. But at the same time, I don't want to argue about the words. You're free to choose whatever terms you think best, but whatever word you pick, it's probably best to stick to it. And I might have fumbled the ball a bit on this score. But if we do opt for the narrower usage, then what I previously called Christian Neoplatonism has to be renamed. Not to worry, the literature is replete with alternatives. We could call the variant Augustinianism, Augustinian Platonism, Christian Platonism, and many other things. For the purposes of this exploration, I will pick Augustinianism, and I'll try to stick to it. But the Neoplatonist elaborations were far from the only interpretations of Plato in play. This should be uncontroversial. It's worth recalling that there was a little-mentioned intermediate period called Middle Platonism, during which there were similar, though opposing, shifts in interpreting Plato's thought, this time towards metaphysical dualism and religious Gnosticism. In this, Plato's thought was seminal. Firstly, Plato distinguished a world of particulars from a world of forms. This distinction was Plato's answer to perennial philosophical problems such as the one in the many and the dichotomy of change and permanence. Questions here include: how do we perceive reality as a unified whole when it appears to be made up of a diversity and a plurality of individual things? Is nothing actually permanent, as Heraclitus thought, or is change an illusion, as Parmenides and Zeno evidently held? Plato's solution to these puzzles was to posit two different realms. One of these, the perceptible world of everyday experience, was the realm of becoming, of change, and of plurality. The other, an imperceptible realm of forms, was unified and permanent. This spills over into what you might call Plato's cognitive dualism of perception on the one hand and conception on the other. This is to say that we explore the world of particulars with our five senses, but the world of forms can only be conceived of or explored with the mind. This bifurcation unfolds into Plato's anthropological dualism. According to this, we humans are composites of two kinds of stuff: material bodies and immaterial souls. Finally, from the standpoint of the theory of knowledge, or epistemology, there's a major dualism between changing, time and space-bound opinion, which is the best we can hope for when we base judgments on the deliverances of perception, and timeless, unchanging knowledge, which, to Plato, has to be grounded in the forms. These nested dualisms suggest a strong connection between Plato and the later Gnostics. Some scholars have even referred to Gnosticism as a kind of Platonism. This association is underscored by the fact that Gnostics sometimes labeled the god of darkness, the creator of what they regard as evil matter, after Plato's demiurge. We'll talk more about all this in a minute. Let's start with this. Augustine was deeply, if indirectly, influenced by Plato. So yes, he seems pretty clearly to have been a Platonist of some sort. Commentators with diverse worldviews agree on this. For example, the late 20th century British philosophy popularizer and television show host Brian Edgar McGee, a self-professed religious agnostic, concisely described St. Augustine's thinking as the fusion of Platonism and Christianity. McGee, despite being ideologically opposed, nevertheless echoed the language of 19th to 20th century French Jesuit theologian Eugene Portalier, who likewise described the bishop's worldview as the fusion of Platonic philosophy with revealed dogmas. Similarly, philology professor Christian Tornow, writing in the standard reference, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, says that Platonism in particular was a decisive ingredient of Augustine's thought. Finally, 20th century American Reformed theologian and philosophy professor Ronald Herman Nash, although espousing a quite different worldview from McGee, Portalier, and, I presume, Tornow, nevertheless also wrote that Augustine's work is a model for those thinkers who would use Platonism as a framework for their Christian world and life views. As far as I can tell, McGee, Nash, Portalier, and Tornow are not occultists in any sense. So what were they thinking when they all classified Augustine basically the same way? We'll look at several reasons for this. As we do, bear in mind that despite the fact that Augustine did draw heavily from Plato via Neoplatonists such as Plotinus, Augustine nevertheless felt at liberty, or even compelled, to modify his sources. Augustine modified his sources out of faithfulness to the Christian scriptures and out of his own genius, in such places as On the City of God Against the Pagans, or The City of God. Augustine wrote clearly and voluminously against forms of paganism such as the popular cults of Isis, Mithra, and Cybele. We can confidently say that on any issue where Plotinus's thought and scripture were irreconcilable, Augustine parted company with Plotinus and sided with the Bible. The same goes for Augustine's treatment of Porphyry and Plato. The only caveat is that due to his indirect access to Plato, Augustine would probably have had difficulty demarcating Plato from Plotinus and Porphyry. As to why Augustine attempted to combine Platonism with Christianity at all, and thought it was permissible to do so, McGee gives plausible suggestions. He wrote, "One thing that made it possible for Augustine to fuse the Platonic tradition and philosophy with Christianity is the fact that Christianity is not, in itself, a philosophy. Its fundamental beliefs are historical rather than philosophical. For instance, that a God made our world and then came to live in the world of his creation as one of the people in it, and appeared on earth as a man called Jesus in a particular part of Palestine at a particular time, and he lived a life that took a certain course, of which we possess historical records. Being a Christian involves, among other things, believing such things as all this, and trying to live in the way God told us, partly through the mouth of Jesus. So Jesus did provide moral instruction, but he was not much given to discussing philosophical questions per se. So it wasn't the case that there was a Platonic philosophy on the one hand, and on the other hand, and at variance with it, something called Christian philosophy, thus giving Augustine the problem of marrying the two. Rather, Augustine, believing that Platonic philosophy embodied important truths that the Bible did not concern itself with, wanted Platonism to be absorbed into the Christian worldview. That's one reason. Another was fondness for the man Plato himself. As noted in the deep dive into Neoplatonism video, the 2nd century Christian apologist and philosopher Justin Martyr called both Socrates and Plato, along with the Old Testament patriarch Abraham, Christians before Christ. And he said this because he believed they followed the divine reason within them. Especially from the standpoint of someone who takes Christian revelation seriously, there are numerous issues with Platonism. Later on, we'll briefly catalog some of these, but it's worth thinking about why some early Christians felt such an affinity for or devotion to Plato, or to Platonism, as that sort of friendly sentiment Justin Martyr expressed. Many reasons for this come from Plato's writings. Consider a provocative passage in Plato's Republic. The character Glaucon explains that if ever the world were to encounter a truly just man, that man would end up being crucified. Doubtless, some overzealous apologists make excessive claims for this text, such as that it was a bona fide prophecy. Still, it's enough for us that it shows Plato's remarkably Christian-sounding moral sensitivities. To some early church fathers, both Greek philosophy and the Old Testament were both preparatory phases that found their culmination in Christianity. We can't forget that Plato put a premium on evaluative notions like beauty, goodness, justice, and truth. Not all Plato's contemporaries had the same sensibilities. The sophists didn't. Besides arraying himself against sophism, Plato also opposed hedonism, materialism, naturalism, relativism, and skepticism. Later thinkers would mobilize the resources of Platonism against other isms, such as atheism, empiricism, and mechanism. Christians also have frequently opposed these ideologies. The upshot is this: Platonism is saturated with many of the same metaphysical assumptions as Christianity, revealing a deep concord between these two seemingly incompatible schools of thought. Much like the Christian God, Plato's form of the good is a divine source of being for all the world. Just as the Christian God is truth and goodness himself, the Platonic forms are the ultimate source of truth and understanding for all things. According to Platonist anthropology, humans are inherently spiritual creatures possessing both a material body and an immaterial soul. Both Platonism and Christianity understand the human soul as naturally calibrated for pursuing questions of the divine, and so on. And of course, in the centuries-long debate over the way to resolve the problem of universals, Plato was an all-flags-flying realist, to borrow the colorful phraseology of philosopher John Cuddeback. Indeed, Plato was the wellspring and primary articulator of realism. Therefore, anyone opposed to the other major position, nominalism, ought to see Plato as at least some kind of ally. As an aside, nominalist thinkers such as the Franciscan friar William of Ockham, along with seminal and radical empiricists like fellow Franciscan Roger Bacon, helped support the growing movement of mysticism in the so-called late Middle Ages. We're talking roughly AD 1300 to 1500. I would also argue, although I won't do so presently, that beside a connection to this proto-empirical strand of medieval mysticism, a strand that paved the road for its Renaissance successors, nominalism is also detectable behind key theological principles that motivated the Protestant Reformation, including, most importantly, sola scriptura, or Bible alone. But I'll have to tackle that another time. For now, concerning Saint Augustine, here's my argument. Augustine was first and foremost a Christian. Augustinianism is a unique and thoroughgoing formulation of Christianity. If Augustine had to choose between leading a hearer to Christian orthodoxy or convincing a reader of some arcane metaphysical contention of Platonism, I'd wager that he'd have chosen the former without hesitation. For all that, however, Augustine's considered, mature, complete Christian worldview may be justifiably classified as a species of Platonism. The object of his philosophy was to give authority the support of reasons. And for him, the great authority was the authority of Christ. And if he loved the Platonists, it was because he counted on finding among them interpretations always in harmony with his faith. Now, at last, let's look at some of the evidence for these claims. An outstanding illustration of Augustine's adherence to Platonism, by way of Neoplatonists such as Plotinus and Porphyry, was his commitment to the existence and immortality of the soul, the latter being the title, incidentally, of his treatise, written around AD 387. By the way, the basics of Plato's argument for the immortality of the soul could be put like this. To destroy something, like a glass water pitcher, for example, is to break it into parts. But to Plato, the soul hasn't got any parts. It's simple. Therefore, the soul cannot be destroyed. As Father Frederick Copleston noted, Plato's dualistic conception of the soul reappeared in Neoplatonism, Saint Augustine, René Descartes, and so on. Augustine wrote, "Among those things which are created by God, the rational soul surpasses them all. And it is nearer to God when it is pure." Not to put too fine a point on it, but in his anthropology, Augustine was firmly Platonist, insisting on the soul's superiority to and independence of the body. One could, not unfairly, think of all this as a combination or a meditation on the Platonic idea of the indestructibility of the soul, the Neoplatonic association of individual souls with the world soul, mentioned in the deep dive video, and portions of the New Testament itself. In the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 10, verse 28, we read, "Do not be afraid of those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. Be afraid of the one who can destroy both soul and body in hell." Now, if taken as a serious piece of metaphysics, as opposed to, say, a metaphor, Matthew 10:28 may be said to imply two things. Firstly, that there is a soul, and secondly, that God is the only being capable of destroying it, since apart from his activity, the soul would otherwise be immortal. Other arguments for the bare existence of the soul, from people like Plato and later Descartes, turn on a point that is now known as the indiscernibility of identicals. This principle states that if two things are identical, then they are also indiscernible. That is, they have all the same properties. So then, Descartes points out, if I can doubt the existence of my body, but I cannot doubt the existence of my mind, because I think, therefore I am, then my body and my mind do not have all the same properties. Descartes seems to be thinking of bodies as having a property like being able to be doubted, while souls have the property being unable to be doubted. But if bodies and souls do not share all the same properties, then they're not identical. Finally, substance dualism of body and soul is suggested to some thinkers on the basis of pure introspection. For example, Plato, Augustine, Descartes, Joseph Butler, and Thomas Reid all held to a view called substance dualism in virtue of being aware of themselves from the first-person perspective as not reducible to or identical to their bodies. This is sometimes cashed out in terms of a consideration called aboutness, or what 19th century philosopher Franz Brentano called intentionality. The property of intentionality is the property of being about something, or being of something. For example, William Lane Craig says, I can think about my summer vacation, or I can think of my wife. But physical objects don't have these sorts of properties. The brain is not about something any more than a chair or a table is about something. It is only thoughts which are of something that have this kind of aboutness to them. But on the view that there is no soul, where instead you have just a brain, intentionality is an illusion. But let's say you're thinking a lot of traditions believe in some kind of soul. How does that show that Augustine was a Platonist? Well, apart from the details of his intellectual formation, which clearly suggests that he was steeped in the books of the Platonists, we can come at the point in a backhanded way by looking at the argument of Plato's critics. I have in mind the anti-soul movement represented by Anglican bishop and New Testament scholar Nicholas Thomas N.T. Wright. Wright is part of a small and diverse group of Christians who are understood as rejecting the soul as a theological concept. For Wright's part, he criticizes modern advocates of body-soul dualism on several grounds, one of which is his view that when Paul and the Gospels use the word psyche, it's clear to Wright that the biblical authors are not using that word in the sense we'd find in Plato or in the Judaic Platonist Philo. When Wright turns his attention to Christian exegesis, he asserts that what the great tradition from Augustine onwards was referring to with respect to certain words like justification and soul is significantly different from what Plato was referring to when he used those words. Thus, Wright objects to a Platonizing of St. Paul and seems to associate aspects of that sort of maneuver with St. Augustine. But contrary to Wright, Augustine evidently believed that an immortal soul, in Plato's sense, was not only what St. Paul had in mind, but was also further reason to commend Plato's perspicacity and his similarity to Christians. But even if Plato is the source of Augustine's arguments for the soul and for its immortality, as seems barely short of a certainty, note that Augustine crucially altered the picture. To Plato and pagan Neoplatonists, the soul and its immortality were related to transmigration. Souls reincarnate. But following the Bible, Augustine rejected this notion. For example, in the book of Hebrews, the first part of verse 27 in chapter 9 tells us, it is appointed for man to die once, not over and over. An even bigger connection between Augustinianism and Platonism was the former's allegiance to the latter's doctrine of forms. To put it slightly differently, Augustine believed in the real existence, independently of particular things, of what Plato called forms or ideas, and what later came to be termed universals. Forms make particular things, like my neighbor's dog, the kinds of things that they are. Fido is a dog because Fido participates in the form of dogness. Since I unpacked this a bit more in the deep dive video, I won't devote a lot of space to it here. Suffice it to say that if we tried to identify Platonism's philosophical core, we'd be hard-pressed to do better than to name Plato's notion of an abstract, immaterial, non-physical, perfect, spaceless, timeless, unchanging realm of forms that not only exists, but that constitutes true reality. The forms lie beyond and make possible our ephemeral experiences and perceptions of the physical world. Physical objects are merely imperfect approximations, copies, echoes, or shadows of the forms. The forms also ground truth claims and make knowledge possible. A realist argues like this. For a sentence like, "this stop sign is red" to be true, there has to be such a thing thing as the stop sign. There has to be such a thing as redness, and the two entities, the stop sign and the redness, have to be related in the correct way. A realist might say that the stop sign exemplifies or instantiates redness. Stop signs are no problem. They're just run-of-the-mill particular objects. But redness? What is that? Well, the realist says that redness is a universal. For our purposes, we'll say redness is one of Plato's forms, and the particular stop sign participates in it. To a Platonist, more important forms lie behind judgments such as equivalence, similarity, and identity. This comes across in the dialogue Phaedo, where Plato argues that we conclude the two things are equal because we have the concept of equivalence already in our minds. To Plato, we don't derive that concept from the world. Rather, we recognize when the world presents us with equal things because deep down we already know what the equal is. We have already had contact with that form. Augustine agreed with Plato's general picture. He held that there are certain principal forms of ideas, or stable and unchanging aspects of things, which are not themselves formed, and which are eternal and always exist in the same way. These ideas neither arise nor perish. However, everything that arises and perishes is said to be formed with them. Augustine seems to be saying that changeable, perishable, temporal things depend upon unchanging, non-perishable, and eternal things. To punctuate the connection with Platonism, he wrote, Plato called these principal aspects of things ideas, but they are not only ideas, they are truths themselves because they are eternal and remain such and unchangeable. But surely a thinker who assents to the core of Platonism qualifies as a Platonist. Nevertheless, Augustine makes a crucial change, saying of the forms, not that they subsist in some Platonic heaven, as Plato had held, but that they're contained in the divine intelligence. Changes like this gave Augustinianism longevity in Christian circles, because they mitigated the elements of Plato that were incompatible with Christianity. Some 800 years later, for example, St. Thomas Aquinas was still favorably quoting Augustine as to the divine ideas. And that's saying something, for Aquinas leaned heavily toward Aristotle. In fact, it was a bone of contention between Aquinas and Bonaventure. The latter believed that Aristotelianism and Christianity were irreconcilable, and so Bonaventure recommended going back to Augustine's Platonism. We shouldn't forget to add to these resemblances the qualified praise that Augustine gave to Platonists. In The City of God, the second of Augustine's two major works, the first being his autobiographical Confessions, he says of the Platonists in chapter 5, their opinions are preferable to those of all other philosophers, going so far as to say that none come nearer to us Christians than do the Platonists. Augustine then described Platonic philosophers as among those who recognized the true God as the author of all things, the source of the light of truth. He commended Platonists as great acknowledgers of so great a God, for not having their minds enslaved to their bodies, thereby supposing the principles of all things to be material, in the manner of those philosophers like Thales, whose central belief is often glossed as all is water, and Anaximenes, all is air, the Stoics, all is fire, or Epicurus or Democritus, all is atoms and the void. Augustine's point is that, like Christians, Platonists have a healthy respect for the spiritual over and above the physical. Both Plato and the scriptures agree that our souls have a special affinity to God, that we are morally responsible for our actions, and that there is a time of reckoning in the world to come. When navigating this terrain, we do need to keep in mind that Augustine expressed antipathy to Hermetic Neoplatonism, or what I call magical Neoplatonism, in the deep dive video. In fact, there was an ongoing rhetorical war between Neoplatonists like Iamblichus and his school, and Christian polemicists like Tertullian and Augustine. Iamblichus attacked Christian views on magic and accused Christians of impiety for denying the divine principles supporting theurgy. Additionally, Neoplatonists vehemently protested against the Christian dogma that human salvation has already been accomplished vicariously through the life and death of a man revered as the Son of God. For many Neoplatonists, the route to salvation was the philosophic life. a sincere and arduous effort of the mind to return to the one and forever abrogate any concerns for the body. Other Neoplatonists base their hopes more on a magical, mystical form of ascent that I distinguished from Augustinian mysticism in my video, 10 Arcane Words. An Augustinian model pictures mystical ascent in terms of turning the intellect's attention toward the divine ideas. Other Christian believers focus on a mysticism whereby they try to unite their human wills with the divine will and achieve what you might call oneness in purpose. Finally, other Christians simply think of mysticism as a personal encounter with Jesus Christ. All of these are very different from the Hermetic Neoplatonic aim, which seems to be to literally unite or reunite one's being with the one. For his part, Augustine does seem to have had room in his system for a sort of ascent of the soul. But for Augustine, this is an intellectual movement. For the soul that becomes attuned to God, the contemplated ascent is a gradual turning of one's attention from earthly matters to divine matters. It is not taken metaphysically as an attempt to reunite your being with the one. In fact, Augustine has dire warnings for those seeking to force a reconciliation with God through magic. Augustine harshly condemned both necromancy and Porphyry's Neoplatonic theurgy as the deceitful rites of demons that are tantamount to criminal tampering with the unseen world. Nevertheless, it would be a mistake to conclude that Augustine took nothing on board from Neoplatonism. It was not for nothing that Plotinus' name was so dear to Augustine, as the late Catholic philosopher and Jesuit Father Frederick Copleston once put it. For, at the very least, as we have said, it was through the Neoplatonists that Platonism made its influence felt on Augustine and on the formative period of medieval thought. The Augustinian philosophy was, through Neoplatonism, strongly impregnated with the thought of Plato. We just sketched that association. So now, let me say something specifically about Augustine's intellectual debt to Neoplatonism. I gestured to some of this in my previous video. Let me prime the pump for this section by opening with Augustine's own words. In his biography, Confessions, he wrote, "God procured for me certain books of the Platonists, translated from Greek into Latin, and therein I read, not indeed in the same words, but to the selfsame effect, enforced by many and various reasons, that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." Here is St. Augustine telling us that he thinks that he's found an echo of the gospel in the books of the Platonists. That's quite remarkable. Of course, Augustine quotes one scripture passage after another. He alternately declares of some Christian doctrines that he does find them in the books of the Platonists, whereas for other doctrines, such as explicitly believing in the name of Jesus, of these he says, "This I did not read there." So Augustine's handling of the Platonists, quote-unquote, is nuanced. And really, as previously stated, Platonists here, of course, means Neoplatonists, like Plotinus and Porphyry. But Augustine is by no means dead set against anything smacking of Platonism. We have to look more closely at Augustine's system. And when we do, I think we won't fail to find substantial overlap between Augustine's thinking and Neoplatonism. For example, in the previous video, we discussed Augustine's Privation account of evil. In this account, good exists, but evil, strictly speaking, does not exist. Evil is just a word for the absence of good. But you can make the case that Augustine's account here owes more to Neoplatonic than directly Platonic influences. Before I suggest how, let's try to get a better handle on Augustine's idea. In the deep dive video, I suggested that you could get a quick fix on the notion by thinking of our commonplace understanding of light. The difference between a well-lit room and a dark room is not that the former is filled with some stuff called light, whereas the latter is filled with some opposing stuff called darkness. Instead, we say that the dark room merely has no light. Light has being. Darkness does not. So it is with good and evil, according to Augustine. And remember, Augustine was not just waxing philosophical. He was arguing against a competing belief system known as Manichaeism, to which he had previously subscribed. Augustine's fascination with Manichaeism was partly motivated by his desire to find a satisfactory solution to the problem of evil. This is the problem of reconciling an imperfect world with the idea of the goodness of God. The Manichae solution was to posit the existence of two different gods, one good and one evil, who were locked in a perpetual war. Thus, Manichaeism advanced a version of Gnostic theological dualism. Now that's all well and good, you're saying, but how does this help to show that Augustine's privation account of evil was inspired by Neoplatonism? Well, think of it this way. Plato wrote his dialogues and then he died. One of the first formal schools to follow him was what is now called Middle Platonism. The salient point is that these Middle Platonists pioneered the dualistic interpretation. Major streams of Gnosticism, which preceded Neoplatonism, were heavily influenced by this teaching, and what was then known as Platonic dualism was eventually embraced by Manichaeism. Augustine's departure from the ranks of the Manichees also marked his turn away from this sort of dualism. So, from where was Augustine inspired to articulate a monistic account of evil? It wasn't from Gnosticism or Middle Platonism. As stated, those earliest non-skeptical interpreters of Plato took it for granted that Plato had taught dualism. Only two groups were toying with monism. One was the Stoics, and they were hardcore materialists. The other, of course, were the Neoplatonists. Plotinian Neoplatonism tended toward monism. We know that Augustine was reading Plotinus and Porphyry anyway, so just speaking about Augustine's personal history, Neoplatonism is a pretty good candidate as his source. When we think about Neoplatonism's beliefs, it clinches it. Recall that Plotinus imbued his all-important and singularly lofty entity, the One, with unsurpassed being and goodness. All subsidiary entities emerged out of, or emanated from, the One. But as derivative beings emerged, they also degraded, both in being and in goodness. Consequently, entities at the bottom of this existential totem pole, or chain of being, such as our bodies and other material things, literally verge on non-being and evil. Now, you don't have to buy into any of the hierarchical metaphysics. Just notice the punchline. I'll say it again if you missed it. For the Neoplatonists, evil was joined at the hip with non-being. I don't know about you, but the fact that evil had little to no existence in the Neoplatonic picture seems awfully similar to Augustine's view that evil is a privation of good. Let me toss in a brief comment about a possible misunderstanding that some people might have regarding what Augustine is saying. The idea that evil is a privation can sound a lot like the claim that there is no such thing as evil, with the consequence that evil cannot or will not be a part of our day-to-day experiences. But it doesn't take 5 seconds to stub your toe or watch the nightly news and recognize that our world is inundated with evil. So realize that in none of these cases, whether of evil or darkness, or the Neoplatonists' concepts of the dregs of emanation, are we prevented from experiencing or perceiving the things in question. If you have trouble seeing this, no pun intended, consider an illustration. Visualize a pothole-covered street. Do you usually say that the street is made of two different things? Asphalt, or whatever, on the one hand, and potholes on the other? No. A pothole is just our shorthand way of referring to a gap in the asphalt. The holes are places where asphalt is broken or missing. Yet the fact that holes don't have separate positive existence doesn't safeguard your ankle if you accidentally step in one, or your tire if you were to drive over it. A second major example of Neoplatonic influence is Augustine's doctrine of divine illumination, according to which human knowledge of the forms, which, recall, are for Augustine the divine ideas, would be impossible without God's direct and imminent assistance. Augustine gives this analogy. Just as the eye of the flesh requires bodily, physical light to see, so too does the intellectual mind require a divine, incorporeal light of a unique kind. Consider that the Gospel of John calls Jesus Christ the true light that gives light to everyone. It is certainly true that alchemists may be inclined to count this passage as evidence that matter contains a light or an invisible fire whose nature is that of the Word who created light on the first day. But this virtual pantheism is not what Augustine had in mind. To Augustine, a personal God illumines the minds of all people. at least to the extent that they recognize any truth at all. But this is an intentional action by which the Christian God guarantees the universality of knowledge, for example, by causing a priori truths to arise within the soul. A lot of this sounds like Plato himself until you realize that for Plato, humans know the forms only by recollection, or what he called anamnesis. For Plato, pre-existent souls inhabit the realm of the forms, where we are able to grasp truths implicitly. Augustine rejected this entire explanation. See further on. For Augustine, humans are capable of knowledge because God implants innate ideas in our souls, not necessarily as fully formed objects of thought, but at least as mental dispositions. However, God does not merely accomplish this once and for all. Rather, he continuously informs and sustains our intellects. This is roughly what is meant by divine illumination, and it has points of contact with the activity and role of the world soul in the Neoplatonic scheme of emanation. Recall that Augustine once held a strain of Manichaeism. Like typical Gnostics, Manichees distinguished a spiritual world of goodness and light from a material world of darkness and evil. To Mani and his followers, for a soul to become embodied, enfleshed, or incarnated was tantamount to something inherently good, a soul, being implicated in something intrinsically evil, a body. But, of course, for Augustine, a soul becoming embodied is not, ipso facto, a fall. In the book of Genesis, chapter 1, verse 31, the Bible says that God saw that everything he had made, the physical universe and everything in it, was very good. The fall is the result of sin, that is, disordered priorities, for example, placing the self over God, and selfish choices. So the Gnostic Manichae story about the inherently evil nature of the flesh would no longer do for Augustine. According to the late Fordham University professor and Jesuit Robert J. O'Connell, when Augustine renounced his Manichaeism, he adopted a Plotinian anthropology instead. On this Neoplatonic view, man is a soul fallen into a body in consequence of some sin that he committed in his pre-existent state. But as we'll discuss more fully in a minute, Augustine eventually rejected the idea of a pre-existent soul. So, as we're now hopefully accustomed to expecting, Augustine modified Plotinus's idea of a pre-existent fall. Following the 2nd century Bishop Irenaeus of Lyon, and we should quickly add, in line with the creation account in the Old Testament book of Genesis, Augustine attributed the fall to Adam's original sin. So, while Augustine does not say that you and I personally sinned in our own pre-existent states, he nonetheless attributed our inherited sinful dispositions to the sin of the first man and woman, Adam and Eve, both of whom pre-existed us. In other words, Augustine appears to have ingeniously adapted Plotinus. Historically, Augustine's important doctrines in this regard emerged in the controversy with the Pelagian heresy, against which Augustine affirmed the reality of the fall and the reality of original sin as the hereditary moral disease that we all bear, which is only curable by God's grace. A number of proposals have been advanced to explain, justify, and understand this claimed link between Adam's sin and our supposed inherited guilt. These theories include, number 1, postulating Adam, the first man, as the federal head of humanity, whose decisions, like those of the federal head of the United States, the president, have consequences for everyone under the relevant jurisdiction, and number 2, suggesting a modal defense, that is, drawing on the apparatus of possible worlds to suppose that in a world where you or I had been the first humans instead of Adam and Eve, we would have sinned just as they did. Today, it's not uncommon to see these doctrines of the fall and of original sin reduced to aphorisms, such as that humans have a propensity to evil. But until the ascendance of nominalism around the 14th century, believers in the doctrines of the fall and original sin analyzed them using the resources of realism. They weren't simply affirmations of the fact that we have all sinned and fall short of the glory of God, to quote St. Paul. Instead, the doctrine of original sin posited that all humans participate in the sin of Adam, where participation, you'll remember, was one of the Platonists' words for the relationship between a particular and its universal. In the Encyclopedia Britannica, Arthur Hillary, A.H. Armstrong, and Henry J. Blumenthal gave a further example that they say shows the most distinctive influence of explicitly Plotinian Neoplatonism on Augustine's thinking about God, namely his Trinitarian theology. The controversial and difficult idea that Christian Trinitarianism itself might have been, well, let's just say anticipated by Neoplatonism was once helpfully and non-technically somewhere summarized by the late evangelical Protestant philosopher Arthur Frank Holmes. In the Neoplatonic picture, absolute reality is an indefinable, spaceless, timeless something known as the One. For more, see once again our deep dive. Subsidiary reality emanates or streams out of the One as light radiates from the sun. Holmes noted that the two highest of these emanations are the Logos and the world soul. From here, in the Neoplatonic hierarchy, individual souls and the rest of perceptible reality arise. Without getting too deep in the weeds, Holmes suggested that the close linkage between the One, the Logos, and the world soul in the Neoplatonic schema has points of contact with, and may have informed the articulation of, the Christian Trinity of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. To motivate this, note firstly that the Apostle John literally referred to Jesus as the Logos in the prologue to the Gospel that bears his name. John 1 verse 1 reads in Koine Greek, en arche ein halagos, kai halagos en proston theon, kai theos ein halagos. In the beginning was the Logos, usually translated Word, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. Or consider a portion of the Nicene Creed recited during typical Sunday Catholic Mass, where the Holy Spirit is said, emanation-like, to proceed from the Father and the Son. Finally, think of typical doctrines held by many Christians, such as the indwelling of the Holy Spirit. According to this, the Spirit lives within Christians, aiding, or even guaranteeing, their ultimate salvation. This underscores the Holy Spirit's intimate connection with individual souls, a connection reminiscent of that which the world soul has with particular souls in Neoplatonism. A final example, cut from similar cloth as the one just surveyed, is the manifestly pantheistic and admittedly paradoxical heart-whole relation that exists between the One and the universe in the Neoplatonic picture. This is to say that, to the textbook Neoplatonist, God is the universe, the One is all. As O'Connell puts it, it takes a firm effort of will to exclude association of this background information with Augustine's thinking on God and on God's relation to the world, which thinking ultimately issued in the Christian doctrine of God's omnipresence. Of course, Augustine once again caveats and qualifies his doctrine. He said, although in speaking of him, we say that God is everywhere present, we must resist carnal ideas and withdraw our mind from our bodily senses, and not imagine that God is distributed through all things by a sort of extension of size, as earth or water or air or light are distributed. The idea of God's omnipresence is difficult on its own. One problem partially stems from the inherent tension in reconciling the concept of God's transcendence, or the idea that God is above, beyond, and distinct from his creation, with God's immanence, or the conviction that God is available, not far from us, as Acts 17:27 puts it, and is somehow present in all aspects of his creation. Multiple models have been proposed to explain God's omnipresence. The aim here is not to survey them. We're simply noting that some commentators find similarities between the doctrine of omnipresence and Platonic pantheism. However, we hasten to add that readers or viewers must guard against the misimpression that the two ideas are equivalent. We're not asserting that they are. Christians especially have been keen to draw out the differences. Of course, despite his qualified embrace of some key Platonic and Neoplatonic doctrines, it would be misleading to say Augustine was a Platonist, full stop. After all, he was more than anything a Christian. And this was partly because he did not find Platonism to be a completely satisfying worldview. What Augustine did not find in the books of the Platonists were things essential to redeeming the times. What Augustine did not find in the books of the Platonists, and had to find in Christian revelation, was a personal God who was a God of justice, but not an immaterial form. A God of love who would listen to prayers and respond. A God of history who entered into history to redeem it. Not a God who remained blissfully apart. Whether for Augustine in the 4th to 5th centuries, or for Christians today, neither Plato nor Aristotle, for that matter, can be accepted precisely as he stands. Aquinas saw this in the latter case. In developing his system of Aristotelian Christianity, what we now think of as Thomism, the angelic doctor modified Aristotle. In this, St. Thomas followed the example of his illustrious predecessor, St. Augustine. As I hope I've adequately shown, Augustine likewise modified Plato and the Neoplatonists whenever he believed that fidelity to biblical revelation demanded it. The aforementioned late Calvinist Baptist Ronald Nash went so far as to describe Platonism as a convenient set of errors against which Augustine painted an alternative picture. Nash goes too far, I think, but from a Christian point of view, there's no question that Platonism has issues. Not least is the wooliness of Plato's conception of God. It's not obvious if Plato thought of his demiurge as God, or whether he reserved that title for his form of the good, or for something else. Commentators line up on both sides of that question, with Gnostics and Neoplatonists, not to mention Middle Platonists and Neo-Pythagoreans, trying to incorporate both constructions, the demiurge and the good, or the one, into their own often convoluted emanationist hierarchies. For Augustine, of course, God is none other than the Holy Trinity, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, as revealed within the Christian Bible. Moreover, the biblical God is personal, not Neoplatonism's impersonal, unknowable one. The Christian God is not only personal and knowable, it is He who has formed us for Himself, and, as Augustine put it, our hearts are restless until they find our rest in Him. Furthermore, the biblical God is the author of salvation history, which has events unfolding over time in a linear fashion towards a conclusion, called the eschaton, or the last things. Platonists, on the other hand, generally advance a cyclical view of history where events repeat ad infinitum. But other problems arise with Plato's main doctrines as well. Another major issue with Platonism is that the Platonic forms, understood as Plato conceived of them, are a threat to the classical theistic picture that predicates of God such properties as his aseity and his unique necessity. Aseity here refers to the idea that the Christian God is radically independent and self-existent. Specifically, the Christian God does not depend on anything outside of himself for his existence. Necessity, as it's come to be modeled by possible world semantics, analyzes claims like God could not have failed to exist as God exists in all possible worlds. As evangelical thinker William Lane Craig puts it, central to classical theism is the conception of God as the sole ultimate reality, the creator of all things apart from himself. This doctrine receives its most significant challenge from Platonism, the view that there are uncreated abstract objects such as numbers, sets, propositions, and so forth. According to Platonism, there is a host of objects, indeed, infinities of beings, which are just as eternal, necessary, and uncreated as God. So, God is not the sole ultimate reality, according to the Platonist. Of course, Augustine saw this problem. This is the reason why he situated the forms inside the mind of God, instead of outside of God. In a recent paper, Craig sketched a range of Platonic alternatives, which we will not rehearse, except to say that the one closest to Augustinianism seems to be the position that Craig calls divine conceptualism. According to this, putative abstract objects like propositions, properties, possible worlds, and mathematical objects are, or are analyzable in terms of, God's thoughts of various sorts. Craig lists Brian Lefto, Alvin Plantinga, and Greg Welty as contemporary defenders of this position, showing that this tenet of Augustinianism has yet to run out of steam. Similarly, Plato has no doctrine of creation, as Augustine came to understand that word. To be sure, in his dialogue Timaeus, Plato imagines that the universe had been crafted out of pre-existent matter, the receptacle, by a benevolent demigod figure that Plato referred to as the demiurge. As to the demiurge's moral character, Timaeus describes it as unreservedly benevolent, and hence desirous of a world as good as possible. But the world remains imperfect, because the demiurge created it out of a chaotic, indeterminate non-being. Just a word on terminology. To the ancient Greeks, the word cosmos implies order. Structure is baked into a cosmos. Our universe is a cosmos because it is law-governed and rational. The opposite of this is chaos. Chaos is inherently disordered, irrational, unstructured, and so on. But to Augustine, an independently existing material receptacle, chaotic or not, is no more compatible with the God of the Bible than were independently existing forms. So, once again, following the lead of the book of Genesis, where it says, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth," Augustine modifies Plato. Instead of holding that the universe was fashioned out of pre-existing stuff, ex materia, Augustine articulates the unique Christian idea of creatio ex nihilo. This is to say that God created the universe out of nothing. Here's a crude analogy. Think of Plato's demiurge as having helped himself to an assortment of pre-existing stuff, like a Lego aficionado with a box of bricks that hasn't yet been assembled. The ancient Greek picture, inherited and embellished by Plato, was that the demiurge took a formless chaos, like a jumble of Lego pieces, and imbued it with order and structure using the forms, like a person building a toy castle with a photograph as her guide or model. But even in an unassembled heap, the prefabricated and standardized Lego blocks exhibit a fairly high degree of incipient structure. In our analogy, the demiurge takes full advantage of pre-existing material that has the latent potential to be shaped into a cosmos, just as the Lego pieces have the latent potential to be put together into a castle. But the God of the Bible doesn't have to rely on any supposed and externally existing material propensities. This point is humorously, but I think persuasively expressed through the joke about the scientist who boasted to God that he could replicate what God had done in Genesis 2:7, where it says, "The Lord God took some dirt from the ground and made a man." So God said to the scientist, "Show me." The scientist smugly accepted and immediately bent over to pick up a handful of soil. But God stopped him, saying, "Oh, no, you don't. Get your own dirt." Carl Sagan, of all people, underscored this very point when he quipped, "If you wish to make an apple pie entirely and truly from scratch, you must first invent the universe." Anything that coexists with the biblical God or pre-exists his creation, such as external matter or independently existing forms, is ruled out of court. This includes pre-existent souls. For Plato, souls are eternal, intrinsically immortal, pre-existent, uncreated, at least in the sense of having been created out of nothing, and souls are even quasi-divine. Before a person's birth, their soul resided in the realm of forms, and after their death, the soul returns to that intellectual or intelligible realm. In this purely spiritual state, Platonic souls have direct, perfect awareness of the forms. However, after an indeterminate amount of time, they are, for various reasons that needn't detain us, and are at any event not quite clear, souls are reincarnated into other bodies. As already mentioned, the New Testament book of Hebrews 9 verse 27 seems to exclude the possibility of reincarnation. But Augustine also rejected emanationism as an explanation of the origin of the soul. This had been proposed by the ancient monist and Neoplatonist Plotinus, and was also propounded in a different form by Gnostic Manichaean dualism. You may remember from the deep dive presentation that Neoplatonic emanationism is also bound up with pantheism, or the idea that literally all is God. Augustine explicitly eschewed this emanationist pantheist system, writing, "The soul is not a part of God, for if it were, then the soul would in every respect be unchangeable and indestructible." According to the 20th century Roman Catholic theologian Ludwig Ott, Augustine's favored view on the soul's origin, in line with his overall theological orientation, is what is known as creationism. This is the idea that every individual soul was created immediately out of nothing by God. Shifting gears to epistemology, for Plato, sense experience cannot deliver knowledge. It's only ever able to generate opinion. Plato represented this in his famous diagram of the divided line. According to it, sense perception aims at the world of ever-changing, spatio-temporal particulars. As such, the deliverances of the senses cannot provide us with eternal, unchanging truths. This was, of course, where and why Plato brought in his forms. As spaceless, timeless, and everlasting, the forms provided the permanence and stability that Plato believed was the sine qua non of knowledge. Augustine recognized that Christian apologetics requires the reliability of sense experience and the possibility of at least some perceptual knowledge. After all, Christians couldn't trust eyewitness reports about Jesus' post-resurrection appearances if sensation and testimony only ever yielded opinions. Augustine alleviated Plato's concerns in several ways. One was to argue that God created our minds so that they could comprehend physical creation. Explicating this lies far afield of our current project. But for Augustine, the explanatory heavy lifting is again done by his doctrine of divine ideas, that is, his version of the Platonic forms, this time the forms acting as the rational patterns for all creation, and Augustine's doctrine of illumination, which we covered previously. Another maneuver, later taken up by Descartes, was to say that humans are made in such a way as to be able to trust the deliverances of our senses. The bulk of Descartes' explanation lies in the reliability of God's benevolence. Descartes thinks that we can know, in a robust sense, that God would not deceive us about our sensory experiences of the external world. Finally, Augustine articulated a dualistic account of human understanding. Accordingly, we have a lower faculty of knowing, which Augustine referred to as scientia, and that faculty is aimed at the physical world, and we also have a higher capacity for wisdom, sapientia, actualized only when our minds are conformed to the divine ideas, the forms, and when we are otherwise properly disposed to things of God. My purpose has been to sketch various ways that Augustine was arguably influenced, not only by Plato, such as Augustine's affinity for Platonic notions of forms and immortal souls, but also by Neoplatonism, as seen, for example, in Augustine's accounts of evil, illumination, and omnipresence. Despite this, we re-emphasize, Augustine nearly always managed to introduce his own unique and Christian spin on these doctrines. An obvious illustration of this was that instead of situating the forms in some sui generis Platonic heaven, as Plato had done, Augustine put them in the mind of God. Or, rather than supposing that souls pre-existed embodiment and would be reincarnated after death, Augustine respected the quite different account that he found in biblical revelation. Augustine's innovations and strong personality led Professors Armstrong and Blumenthal to say, in their previously cited article for the Encyclopaedia Britannica, that Augustine's thought was not merely a subspecies of Christian Platonism, but something unique, Augustinianism. An analog of this classification issue arose in a previous video with respect to the important analytic philosopher Bertrand Russell. The question was, is Russell Platonic or anti-Platonic? Without rehearsing the entire answer, the CliffsNotes version was, it depends. If you think that the core of being Platonic is adopting a mystical posture toward ultimate reality, as the Neoplatonists did from Plotinus onward, then sure, Russell comes across as anti-Platonic. Something similar could be said about Augustine. For listen to what one commentator, writing in the 1913 edition of the Catholic Encyclopedia under the heading Teaching of Saint Augustine of Hippo, said about the good bishop. The role of Origen, who engrafted Neoplatonism on the Christian schools of the East, was akin to that of Augustine in the West, with the difference, however, that the Bishop of Hippo was better able to detach the truths of Platonism from the dreams of Oriental imagination. In other words, Origen and Augustine were both influenced by Platonism. The major difference was that St. Augustine downplayed, modified, or outright rejected the various magical, mystical, and miscellaneous religious intrusions introduced by Plato's Neoplatonic successors, whereas Origen, and arguably the entire ancient school at Alexandria, hewed much more closely to Pythagoras, Plato, Plotinus, and Plotinus' successors, for good or ill. Of course, Origenism, which included such doctrines as a subordinationist Christology, a universalist soteriology, an anthropology of pre-existence of the soul, and an extravagant preference for allegorical hermeneutics, was condemned multiple times, from local synods held at Alexandria and Constantinople to, ultimately, the official ecumenical council of Constantinople II in 553. Such was not the outcome for Augustine, who was canonized a saint in 1303. Nonetheless, add the encyclopedist of the vaunted Britannica, the reading of Plotinus and Porphyry in Latin translations had a decisive influence on Augustine's religious and intellectual development, and he was more deeply and directly affected by Neoplatonism than any of his Western contemporaries and successors. When you think about these statements side by side, they imply that Augustine was basically able to backwards engineer or reconstruct an earlier form of Platonism from his interaction with Neoplatonic sources. Thus, although Augustine conformed fairly closely to the general pattern of Christian Platonism, his his overall philosophy ended up being much closer to Middle Platonism than Neoplatonism. Whether this was divine guidance or not, it's nothing short of astounding. But let's leave aside the vexed topic of mysticism. After all, as we've said, to a large extent, mysticism was added by Plato's disciples, people such as Plotinus, Iamblichus, and so on, rather than by the old man himself. As already stated, if we take the most distinctive Platonic idea to be the existence of the aforementioned extramental ideal forms that undergird reality and give a philosophical ground to truth claims, then it turns out that both Augustine and Bertrand Russell were, in this sense, Platonists of some sort, for Russell at least at some points over his long career. That Augustine and Russell are worlds apart in numerous other respects, not least their beliefs about God, shows that Platonism is a big tent, which is what my taxonomy was hinting at. But it shouldn't surprise us that Plato's influence was so wide as to affect both the Christian and Saint Augustine, as well as the agnostic atheist Bertrand Russell. Recall Alfred North and Whitehead's quip that the safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists in a series of footnotes to Plato. Socrates' illustrious student was so influential that one is hard-pressed to find Western thinkers who have not been influenced to one degree or other by Plato, not least of whom was Aristotle. At the same time, Plato's degree of influence varies widely, and to be sure, sometimes it's a matter of disagreement rather than agreement. But even in cases of opposition, one finds that Plato has, for all intents and purposes, often framed the discussion. This is the case as much with the Bishop of Hippo and Russell as with others, including Karl Popper, who took the view that Plato's Republic, often held aloft as a model of ideal society, was really nothing other than a blueprint for totalitarianism. The thinkers impacted by Plato are so numerous and cut across so many diverse fields, from art and literature to education and psychology to philosophy and theology, that one could barely scratch the surface in an encyclopedia, let alone a single paper or video production. Or two. Additionally, in-depth treatments could be written about each of the many persons who owe an intellectual debt to Plato, many of whom wrote voluminously and were influential in their own right. We'll just leave you with the thought that if we had to pick a chief among those people who were, broadly speaking, Platonists, St. Augustine would be in the running, as it were. One academic, writing in 2021, states, "Some of the most interesting topics discussed currently regard the lines of continuity between the medieval and Renaissance perceptions of Platonism and Hermeticism. Since the bulk of this paper has focused on the former, Platonism, it's probably useful to say something about Hermeticism as well." Hermeticism was a long-standing school of philosophy drawn from the study of the Corpus Hermeticum, the magical texts attributed to the Egyptian priest, king, and philosopher Hermes Trismegistus, believed to have been a contemporary and spiritual equal of Moses. To Hermeticists, then, the Corpus Hermeticum formed a source of wisdom on a par with the Old Testament. According to the 1993 book The Egyptian Hermes, one of Hermeticism's core historical contentions was that even the wisest representations of other traditions were acknowledged to have sat at the feet of the Egyptian priests. This included Moses among the Jews and Solon, Pythagoras, and Plato among the Greeks. By the time you get to the Neoplatonist Iamblichus, it was common scholarly opinion that both Pythagoras and Plato had visited Egypt in order to study the Hermetica, with the help of native priests. This belief manifested in competing lists of sages that included such other far-flung characters as Orpheus and Zoroaster, all of whom supposedly owed their learning to Thoth Hermes. Now, these beliefs tell us many valuable things about the thinkers who formulated and held them, but they tell us much less, if anything at all, about the historical Moses, Plato, and Pythagoras themselves. Incidentally, we're confronted with a similar case in the so-called apocryphal Gospels. These are Gnostic texts that make claims about the life of Jesus of Nazareth that are at odds with the picture given in the four canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The majority of these texts are products of the 2nd and 3rd century, with little relevance for answering questions about the historical Jesus of 1st century Judea. But the texts are highly intriguing for gaining insight into the perspectives of their authors and of the communities that read them. Thus, from the fact that many Neoplatonists and other Hermeticists from the 3rd century AD on thought that Plato had been a disciple of Hermes or represented Plato that way, it by no means follows that Plato was a Hermeticist in any substantive sense, other than, of course, believing in the existence of souls or in the ability of souls to, in some sense, ascend to the divine. But then again, many Christian beliefs are close cousins in these regards, and yet Christians are not ipso facto Hermeticists. Nevertheless, you may suspect that it was inevitable that Hermeticists from at least the 3rd and 4th centuries onward would seek to interpret Christian luminaries, such as Saint Augustine, as one of their own. And indeed, some Hermeticists did lay claim to Augustine. For instance, Giordano Bruno, Marsilio Ficino, Tommaso Campanella, and Giovanni Pico della Mirandola used as sources those Christian writers, including Tertullian, Lactantius, and Augustine, who included Hermeticism as part of their defense of Christian doctrines through quotations. A low-grade contemporary example of this comes from the occult-friendly writer Jason Louv, who reported that even previous Christian intellectual giants like St. Thomas Aquinas and St. Augustine considered Hermes Trismegistus to be a pagan prophet and forerunner of Christianity. However, Pace Louv, whereas the pertinent ancient Christians selectively quoted the Hermetica for apologetical purposes, that is, to buttress what is now called orthodoxy, the latter thinkers, Bruno, Ficino, Pico, and so on, by classifying Hermes as a wise pagan prophet who foresaw the coming of Christianity, sought to lionize Trismegistus in furtherance of Renaissance syncretism. In other words, the early apologists used the popularity of Hermes to encourage people to take a look at Christianity. The idea was to say, hey, for all of you who revere Hermes, did you know that he said this or that? Where this and that are some quotations thought to have value in the defense of the Christian faith. For example, St. Augustine, in The City of God, Book 8, Chapter 24, points out that Hermes himself was reported to have said the following: "Our forefathers erred very far with respect to the knowledge of the gods. They invented this art of making gods. They evoked demons or angels and united them with holy images, in order that through demonic souls the images might have the power to do good or harm to men." Augustine then marvels at this admission, commenting that, quote, "I know not whether the demons themselves could have been made, even by adjuration, to confess as Hermes has confessed in these words." And Augustine rhetorically asks, does Hermes say that it was a moderate degree of error which resulted in their discovery of the art of making gods? No, he must needs add very far, and says they erred very far. End quote. So you can see the apologetical thrust. For Augustine, we're fallen, and consequently, when we convince ourselves that we can be spiritual by ourselves without first being reconciled to the true God on his terms, we end up dealing with demons. God-making and theurgy become demonolatry and idolatry. And if even Hermes says that paganism gets things wrong on these scores, then pagans might just be open to hearing about the Christian alternative. Pico, on the other hand, in his Oration on the Dignity of Man, cites Hermes in the introductory paragraph to the effect that humans are marvelous and miraculous. So for Pico and many others in the Renaissance, man can do a lot on his own by way of Christian Kabbalah, natural magic, and allied occult arts. Pico wants to trace his optimistic view of human nature back through history, and by so doing, he finds the seeds of a supposed ancient theology woven through more religions than just Christianity. Pico summons authorities like Hermes to motivate and prop up his quest for this ancient theology, or Prisca Theologia. These goals, apologetics versus syncretism, are very different. Or consider Ananda Kentish, A.K. Kumaraswamy. Kumaraswamy was a proponent of what is now called perennialism, a philosophy also espoused by René Guénon, Aldo Huxley, Fritjof Schuon, and others, that tends to ground theological claims in religious experience, and that holds that there is a core of truth detectable in almost all religions. Kumaraswami's premises led him, preposterously in my opinion, to conclude such things as that Augustine's maxim, "I believe that I may understand," is a version of the Hermetic precept, "as above, so below." For a similarly doubtful assertion pertaining to St. Thomas Aquinas, I invite you to see my written work, especially in Appendix B, Was Aquinas an Alchemist? But that Augustine, inter alia, read from, interacted with, and selectively quoted the Corpus Hermeticum, no more proves that Augustine was a covert Hermeticist than do the facts that William Lane Craig reads from, interacts with, and selectively quotes from his atheist debating opponents reveal Craig to be a crypto-atheist. We need to know the verdicts that they pass on this material, and it's worth considering the history. Tertullian, the 2nd to 3rd century Carthaginian Christian apologist and heresiologist, was consistently negative in his assessment of the Hermetica. In his tractate Against the Gnostics, written in the early 3rd century AD, Tertullian called Mercurius Trismegistus, or Hermes, the father of all occultism. For Tertullian, Plato himself was the spice of all heretics. In the 4th century, Hermes too was inculpated or accused. For example, Marcellus of Ancura held that all heresies were inspired by the impious trio of Hermes, Plato, and Aristotle, since it was impossible to him that heresies could be founded on the pure and undivided traditions of the Apostolic Church. Or again, Arnobius of Sicca, a pagan rhetor turned Christian polemicist, writing in the early years of the 4th century, addressed his pagan opponents as "you who follow after Mercury, Plato, and Pythagoras." Simultaneously, however, you had the influential 3rd to 4th century Christian apologist and Roman statesman Lactantius maintaining a more positive view of Hermes as an authoritative Egyptian sage and theologian who preached Christian theology before Christ. To Lactantius, Hermetic religion was a true, divinely revealed philosophy whose ultimate goal was piety toward God. In terms of its basic structure, this was exactly how Lactantius wished to present Christian thought. Between these two extremes, Augustine seems to have steered something of a middle course. For St. Augustine, although some aspects of the Hermetic doctrine were not the work of the Holy Spirit, but a spirit of lies, Augustine nevertheless said that Hermes made many statements agreeable to the truth concerning the one true God who fashioned this world. And as to Hermes' status as a prophet, Hermes seemed to predict the time in which the Christian religion would overthrow all lying figments. But then he goes on to say, when Hermes predicted these things, Hermes spoke as a friend to those systems rather than as a true prophet of God who was seeking to have them overthrown. Augustine's mediating position wasn't unprecedented. It compares to that of Cyril of Alexandria, who favorably juxtaposed Hermes and Moses, saying that the two were generally of like mind, but still caveating that with the idea that Hermes wasn't correct and above reproach in everything. Still, Augustine clearly condemned all kinds of magic and classified incantations, charms, necromancy, and theurgy as demonolatry. Augustine addressed several chapters in the City of God against Platonists like Porphyry even, who insisted on the divine aspects of theurgy. Notice that the red line for Augustine was anything having to do with sorcery. Augustine's City of God taught that pagan gods were actually demons and that magicians drew upon satanic power, whether they realized it or not. Just as Plato's philosophy ramified into Middle Platonism, Gnosticism, and Neoplatonism of various sorts, including Augustinianism, so too was their variation within Hermeticism, although perhaps not so wide. There are a couple of illustrations of this variety. Take the honorific Trismegistus itself, which translates into the phrase thrice great. For some more pagan enthusiasts, Hermes' triple greatness owed to his alleged mastery of alchemy, astrology, and magic. According to other believers, more willing to take on board some of the truths of Christianity, the title thrice great was a takeoff of Jesus Christ's special prerogatives in the Lord's capacity as prophet, priest, and king, following Moses, Abel, and David respectively. But quite likely, for a third group of Hermeticists, the two explanations dovetailed in their imagination. The second example of Hermeticism's diversity applies to the story of Hermes' origins. As mentioned above, Hermes the 3 times great emerged from Egyptian myth, where he supposedly started off as the god variously known as Tahuti, Thuth, Thoth, or whatever. By the 4th century AD, some Greek Hermeticists had taken the line of least resistance and just continued to depict Hermes in these unmistakably Egyptian terms, propagating a version of Trismegistus that was scarcely Hellenized at all, except in name. On the other hand, there were Hermeticists who looked at things from a more thoroughgoing Greek point of view, and to some extent played down various specific Egyptian elements and assumed that, in origin at least, Hermes had initially been human. Incidentally, during the late 2nd century AD, Clement of Alexandria accused pagan Greeks, who went the Hermes as human route, of being atheists. In his exhortation to the Greeks, Clement claimed that the pagan gods were nothing but divinized ancient men. Thus, they were fake gods. They weren't gods at all, and anyone who believed in them, therefore, didn't actually believe in God and was an atheist. But if Christian polemicists like Clement asserted Hermes' humanity as an attack against Hermeticism, it invites a further question: what did Plato believe? Plato becomes relevant here because without coming down clearly on one side or the other, he puts into the mouth of Socrates an allusion to the Egyptian story about a god or godlike man whose name was Thoth, Hermes. In another place, Plato has Socrates say that Tammuz, the mythical pharaoh of ancient Upper Egypt, was taught the art of writing from Thoth. But mostly these references to Hermes are nothing more than one-liners. It is for this reason that Plato is not usually classified as a Hermeticist himself. In fact, I'm unaware of any dedicated Plato scholar who represents him that way. For example, the well-known 19th to 20th century British idealist Alfred Edward A.E. Taylor, in his Plato, The Man and His Work, doesn't list Hermes or Thoth in his index. And when I searched an electronic copy at the Internet Archive, there were only 4 hits for Hermes and 1 for Thoth. But these were ancillary quotations and were not part of any discussion about Hermeticism. Typical examples include instances where Plato used the phrase Star of Hermes evidently as a euphemism for the planet Mercury. I similarly came up with next to nothing in volumes by Harold Frederick Chernus, John Niemeyer Findley, and Gregory Vlastos, and although that may reflect my ignorance more than anything, the possibility that Plato was a Hermeticist in the most obvious sense, namely that he pored over the Hermetica, can, for all intents and purposes, arguably be laid to rest by the philological thesis of the 16th to 17th century French-Swiss scholar Isaac Casaubon. According to Casaubon, the Corpus Hermeticum, which was more or less the definitive articulation of the Hermetic worldview, was written between circa AD 100 and 300, rather than in some primordial period. But this interval, between the 2nd and 4th centuries AD, was far too late to have been able to produce a text that could have been read by the historical Plato. After all, Plato lived 450 to 650 years before that, between 428 and 347 BC. The influential group of Egyptian religious thinkers known as Hermeticists do predate the rise of Neoplatonism, and as such, their texts might have informed the worldview of people like Plotinus and Porphyry. As a Hellenistic phenomenon, esoteric Hermeticism can be traced back to around the 1st century AD. For example, at that time, Plutarch refers to Hermes, the thrice greatest. Not only this, but the various Hermetic texts, some 17 of them, weren't brought together under a single cover until the Middle Ages in Byzantium. So in other words, the dating of the texts of the Corpus Hermeticum would have to be off by roughly 500 years before Plato could even have been influenced by a single one of them. And in addition to that, even if he had been influenced by one, it's unlikely he would have been influenced by the bulk of them, since they weren't brought together until far, far later. Now, until Casaubon, these manuscripts were classically attributed to the mythic Hermes Trismegistus, in line with the belief that Hermes was a prehistoric figure who was the fountainhead of esoteric and philosophical wisdom. So it's likely that some people, like Plotinus and Porphyry, for example, may have believed that these texts were written well before Plato and that Plato had been familiar with them. But of course, the Casaubon rewriting of the history requires not just that we modify our belief about the text, requires that we modify our belief about what Plato would have had access to. Now, from its continuation in Byzantium, The tradition crossed back over into the West via Gemistus Plethon, or Pletho, who attended some of the important sessions of the Council of Basel, Ferrara, and Florence. With the financial backing of Italian banker Cosimo de' Medici, the Corpus Hermeticum was partially translated into Latin by the 15th century Italian humanist Marsilio Ficino, and then more fully translated later by Lodovico Lazzarelli. People like Giovanni Pico della Mirandola mixed the newly Latinized Byzantine Hermeticism with Neoplatonism and Kabbalah, producing a heavily magic-infused variety of occultism. This Hermetic Neoplatonism did become the dominant and most influential form of Platonism throughout the Renaissance. Francis Yates makes this abundantly clear. Yates refers to a Hermetic Kabbalist core which modern scholarship has revealed within Renaissance Neoplatonism, and she notes the interconnection with magic. For example, she states that Marsilio Ficino trafficked in Hermetic magic, while Pico was trained in Kabbalistic magic. So once you get to the Renaissance, indeed, Hermetic Neoplatonism seems to be the only game in town. And it was natural that these Hermeticists, like Pico, would have interpreted Plato as a friend. Again, they were laboring under some misconceptions about the Corpus Hermeticum that weren't disabused until roughly 100 years later. According to Yates, Pico's Renaissance project self-consciously and arrogantly sought a synthesis of all philosophies and concerned itself with magic drawn from the Hermetic sources, Platonic and Neoplatonic texts, Orphic hymns, and Chaldean oracles. What interested Yates was the fact, which she said was little acknowledged or explored at the time of her writing, that Pico's was also a religious movement, believed to be compatible with Christianity. For Pico had intended to create a harmonious synthesis of Plato, Aristotle, and Christianity, but also to reinterpret Christianity through the Kabbalah and magic. All that said, some contemporary scholars now challenge Francis Yates' beliefs, including the one that says Hermeticism was an identifiable movement or ideology at all. Regardless, the point is, Ficino, Pico, and company wanted to be able to claim Plato as much as, and probably even more than, they wanted to claim Augustine. And this compromises their objectivity. For that reason alone, we can no more count on the accuracy of occultists' claims about Augustine than we can about their claims about Plato. In my view, they were as mistaken to think of Augustine as an ally of Christian Kabbalah as they were to count Plato as a friend to Hermetic Neoplatonism. What we want to know is, what did Plato believe? And for that, we can ask, what did Plato's earliest interpreters say? Admittedly, it may well be a fact that Plato's earliest interpreters were themselves more often than not Hermeticists. Gnosticism and Neoplatonism were cross-pollinated with that movement, after all. For example, the alchemist and Gnostic philosopher Zosimus of Panopolis was a convinced Hermeticist. He was as convinced as the magician and Neoplatonist Iamblichus. Moreover, the extensive Gnostic Nag Hammadi collection also included many volumes of the Hermetica. And important Gnostics, including Valentinus, drew on Hermes along with Plato and Aristotle when they formulated their doctrines. The Neoplatonist Iamblichus, mentioned many times, wrote about Hermeticism in such works as On the Mysteries, as well as in his commentary on Plato's Timaeus. The ancient version of Neoplatonism was similar to its Renaissance counterpart in that its signature project also aimed at creating a grand synthesis, one that absorbed, appropriated, and creatively harmonized almost the entire range of Hellenic tradition, including philosophy, religion, and extant literature, with the exceptions of Epicureanism, which it roundly rejected, as well as the thoroughgoing corporealism of the Stoics. Another major difference, however, was that the earliest proponents of ancient Neoplatonism were variously indifferent to, ignorant of, or even set against Christianity, whereas in the Renaissance, the major Western Neoplatonists were supposedly Christians themselves. Ficino was allegedly a priest, and Pico claimed to be a Christian. On the other hand, as regrettable as it may be, the Hermetica was widely read by Christians in the relevant period. This leads people like Grant Fountain to note that this fondness for Hermes Trismegistus and its attending syncretistic thinking reflected a broader consensus than what could be explained merely by the influence of Neoplatonism. Syncretism showed up in the ancient world in Manichaeanism as well, as we've noted. Evidently, Mani claimed as heralds of his message Hermes of Egypt, Plato the Greek, and Jesus, who appeared in Judea. But as far as goes the influence of Hermeticism on the seminal Plotinian form of Neoplatonism, Christian Weilberg, in his article for Stanford's Encyclopedia of Philosophy, merely says, number one, that it's not impossible that Gnosticism, which Plotinus vehemently opposed, as well as the writings circulating under the name of Hermes Trismegistus, confirmed or even informed his metaphysical monism. And Weilberg says, number 2, Neoplatonists shared with the Stoics and the Hermeticists the belief that reality in all its cognitive and physical manifestations depended on a highest principle which is unitary and singular. But beyond these basic commitments, even Neoplatonism's earliest entanglement with Hermeticism is somewhat debatable. Now, to get a slightly clearer picture of why, if he was not a Hermeticist, Plato would have mentioned the name Hermes and any of the Hermes lore at all, I would like to suggest comparing and contrasting the scattered references to Hermes in Plato's corpus to Plato's treatment of fabled Atlantis. Plato's Atlantean material is concentrated in 2 of his so-called late-period dialogues, Timaeus and Critias. I think it's both fair and obvious to say that Plato's treatment of the story of Atlantis is more deliberate and more sustained than anything he says about Hermes. Notwithstanding this, writers, both ancient and modern, are divided over the question of whether Plato intended it to be a fictional metaphorical or a historical literal account of the ill-fated island. Plato's early commentator, Crantor of Soli, is typically said to have been in the historico-literal camp. On the other hand, Plato's most illustrious student, Aristotle, is oft-cited as an example of a thinker who understood Plato to have been writing non-literally when he mentioned Atlantis. Now, this strikes me as quite revealing. The Atlantean material, despite being fairly clearly set forth in what amounts to several pages of sustained text in modern translations, has been given various conflicting interpretations over time. In other words, Plato tells the story of Atlantis in a contiguous fashion. He just lays it out there. And yet we don't know whether he meant it to be taken literally or not. But then contrast this with these scattered one-line references to Hermes, and I think we have very little to go on with respect to context about what he intended with Hermes if we can't even figure out what he intended with Atlantis. Disputes over how to understand Plato's references to any philosophical Hermetica, including his fleeting precursory references to Hermes, fits into the long-standing and far-reaching controversies about the overall interpretation of Plato. The confusion then is sort of par for the course, at least for those aspects of Plato that lie beyond his philosophical core. So if we're not talking about his view of forms, for example, which he writes about over and over again in multiple ways, then it gets a little bit difficult to interpret some of his fleeting references. And even with the forms, Plato, in his Parmenides, subjects his own doctrine to such withering scrutiny that some commentators have argued that Plato abandoned it. It's not for nothing that skepticism was the earliest dominant perspective to take over Plato's Academy after its founder's death. But if you would like additional evidence to get a sense of how difficult it is to interpret Plato sometimes, you only have to recall the fact that both Gnostics, who were dualists, and Neoplatonists, who were monists, appealed to Plato as their authority, and they had quite disparate metaphysics. So, on the face of it, I'd submit that there's at least as much reason to take Plato's Hermes references metaphorically as there is to take his Atlantis references that way. You could always take Plato literally in both, but I'd say the literal reading is more plausible in the case of Atlantis. So if you are inclined to take Plato metaphorically about Atlantis, then a fortiori, you'd think of his Hermeticism, quote-unquote, as merely figurative. And again, you have to remember that he predated the Hermetica, strictly so-called. Finally, I'd point out that I couldn't find even a single mention of Hermes, whether in that Greek form or as Mercury, Thoth, etc., and I couldn't find a single reference to Hermeticism in any of the overviews of Plato or Platonism widely available in the Catholic Encyclopedia, the Encyclopedia Britannica, nor any of several articles on either the Internet or Stanford Encyclopedias of Philosophy. Now, I don't say that my research was exhaustive, and admittedly the inclusion or omission of certain material might simply reflect the biases of the article's authors, but for comparison purposes, there are 4 such explicit references in Iamblichus's Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry. There are 5 in the one for Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, and Marsilio Ficino's article has 12 such references. So my thought is that had Plato been anywhere near as wrapped up with Hermeticism as some of his ancient and Renaissance Neoplatonic interpreters, surely one of these basic entries would have at least alluded to it. You cannot sketch the beliefs of Marsilio Ficino without reference to Hermeticism, and evidence for that is the fact that his basic article, which does purport to sketch his beliefs, has to reference Hermes or Hermeticism 12 times. But that's not the case with Plato, and we're not talking about a single article. We're talking about articles about his metaphysics, his ethics, his epistemology, his overall philosophy. None of those articles make any reference at all, zero, to Hermeticism. Copleston, in the first volume of his Philosophical Survey, only brings up Hermes in the context of Neo-Pythagoreanism, and Copleston writes, "In connection with Neo-Pythagoreanism stands the so-called Hermetic literature and the Chaldean oracles. The former is the name given to a type of mystical literature that arose in the 1st century AD, and that may or may not owe a debt to previous Egyptian writings. The Greeks found in Hermes the Egyptian god Thoth, and their appellation Hermes Trismegistus is derived from the Egyptian Great Thoth, or Thoth. But whatever be the truth concerning the supposed influence of Egyptian tradition on the Hermetic literature, the latter owes its main contents to earlier Greek philosophy and seems to have been indebted particularly to Posidonius. The fundamental notion expressed, still quoting Copleston, in this literature is that of salvation through knowledge of God, gnosis, a notion that played a great part in Gnosticism. A similar doctrine of salvation, however, is found in the content of the Chaldean Oracles, a poem that was composed about 200 AD, and which, like the Hermetic literature, combines Orphism and Pythagoreanism, Platonism, and Stoicism. In its close relation to the religious interest and needs of the time, and in the work of preparing the ground for Neoplatonism, Neo-Pythagoreanism resembles Middle Platonism." End quote from Frederick Copleston. On a similar wavelength, in the Encyclopedia of Philosophy's article Middle Platonism, Arthur Edward Moore references Hermes, or a cognate word, fully 18 times. But in the crucial section number 7, titled Esoteric Platonism, where the author treats Hermeticism, Gnosticism, and the Chaldean oracles in that order, Plato himself is only mentioned once. This reference occurs when Moore is describing the Hermetic text known as the Poimandres, or the Pymander. Moore calls this the most important treatise in the Corpus Hermeticum for the history of Platonism. And then Moore remarks that the unknown author of the Poimander was, quote, dependent on both Plato's Timaeus as well as on the Book of Genesis, especially as those two works were interpreted by Philo. Now, as far as this goes, it's excellent evidence that Hermeticism was Platonic. Among other things, however, it fails to show that Plato, the man, was a Hermeticist. Now, there are certain commentators who propose that Plato had intended to round out the Timaeus and the Critias into a trilogy with a third installment that presumably would have been titled the Hermocrates. This is by inference from a line in Critias where Plato depicts Socrates promising Critias that he, Critias, will be afforded the same opportunity to speak that is also granted to Hermocrates and Timaeus. In other words, the dialogue has all four of these characters, Critias, Hermocrates, Socrates, and Timaeus, in conversation with one another. And since Hermocrates never really got a chance to speak in the dialogues that we have, Timaeus and Critias, it's supposed, therefore, that Plato had intended to write a third final dialogue to complete that series. That Plato considered writing, or had resolved to write, a dialogue titled Hermocrates is purely hypothetical. To say that we have any idea what Plato would have written is, in my opinion, sheer speculation. And whichever way you go on those questions will reflect your suppositions rather than telling us anything about Plato himself. By the way, Hermocrates, the word, supposedly means gifted by Hermes. Now, in short, I don't find, personally, much reason to consider Plato a Hermeticist himself. It's one thing to see a link between Hermetic and Neoplatonic thought, because the two do come into close approach. But Gnosticism, Hermeticism, Neoplatonism, and Platonism differ from one another. Not only that, but when you get into the history of each of these, Neoplatonism changes its contours from the ancient period to the Renaissance period, and even from the early ancient period to the late ancient period. To put it somewhat tongue-in-cheek, we needn't seek a Hermeticist under every occult bush any more than we need to blame George Soros for every societal ill. And insofar as Saint Augustine distanced himself from the excesses of all of these systems, Gnosticism, Hermeticism, Neoplatonism, and Platonism, I, for one, don't find anything off-putting about classifying him as a Platonist or as a Neoplatonist when the evidence warrants it, with the qualifier Christian duly affixed, of course. But as I started off by saying, if you prefer different, stricter uses of those words, then you could call him simply an Augustinian and reference his system for the uniqueness that it has, in the same way that we refer to the uniqueness of Aquinas' system as Thomism.